The topic of this lecture is language varieties. ASL is not exactly the same everywhere it's used. There are a few reasons for this. First are different types of impact on lexical change or variation. Words or signs may change over time. In addition, in different places, different changes occur, resulting in variation. It may be simple if we separate variation from natural lexical change this way. Reduction of sign forms happen when a complex movement that is difficult to produce is selectively reduced to make it easier to produce. That's one way. A second way is that separation between the original context and subsequent transmission and reanalysis creates variation. The key point here is that signs change over time, so you have to see where it historically originated. The original form will eventually be transmitted to various places. When that happens, sign changes occur independently of change in other places, now that they're separate from the original context. This happens because the people in each community reanalyze the signs and alter how the sign is produced. I'll talk about this in more detail. I'll go over this grayed out part at the end when I summarize this discussion. There are different ways that people form signs. Studies show that this variation often has to do with social groups, which is called sociolinguistic variation. The first recognition of this appears in Kronberg's appendix in the 1965 Dictionary of ASL. He describes observations of sign varieties that were tied to where people live, or geography. So distinct geographic areas can have different signs. Also, there can be different social groups based on heritage that can be insular, leading to variation based on social class. Social class can also include gender, so males and females may sign differently. Often this is tied to schooling practices. If boys and girls are sent to different schools, especially in countries with religious-based schools, they'll be educated separately. Now, as these children grow older, eventually getting married and starting families, often they find that the men sign one way, and the female variant of signs can't be used in the family, at deaf clubs, or in the community. Women's ways of signing are generally not accepted, so the only time they sign this way is when they're in a female-only context. This is the case in several countries. For regional dialects, within the same area, sometimes there are separate schools, which can influence variation. The language of one school will evolve as people there use it, while language will evolve differently at the other school, creating a divergence. This results in different dialects. About schools, often here in America, there's one school per state that all students in that area go to. Since each state has its own school, when students from these schools meet each other as adults, they find that they sign differently. These are regional dialects. Now, these studies make the important point that a community of people is not just one thing. There are multiple communities, each of which can have their own way of signing. Also, geopolitical boundaries have an influence. There are some places in the world where a community is formed based on a shared language and culture, and are largely isolated from other groups. What happens is that their politics and governments operate separately, with separate schools. As a result, they sign differently because of these geographic boundaries, which are not only physical, but political as well. Often this happens in countries separated by multiple languages. Usually the signed languages in these countries are also different because of that community's history. This doesn't mean that they're dependent on the spoken language, it's just that they form according to the same natural divisions in the community based on language. Often there are different schools for each language community, including schools for deaf students, reinforcing the boundaries between communities. For example, in Switzerland, there are 3 different spoken languages: French, German, and Italian. Deaf people in each of these linguistic communities have different sign languages. Now, this also happened in America. We can study the impact of community and governmental segregation practices in America by using Black ASL, which has its own history. The emergence of Black ASL was a result of new segregated schools being established in the late 19th century throughout the Southeast. Some cities had both segregated schools. Those are indicated in dark blue. Other states established the schools in two different cities, miles apart. No matter how close or far they were, the fact that they were segregated meant that the school children didn't interact much. Over time, their signs, even if they started out the same, because some of the school's founders were from the Hartford area and came just to help the school get started, would diverge over time, evolving differently. I'll talk more about these schools next. The time span of Black ASL dialects parallels the history of isolation. Whether Black ASL is still in use today is currently under discussion. Investigation shows that its use may be on the decline. This is primarily because these schools no longer exist today. As segregation ended and schools were integrated, now dialects of Black ASL were only used by older people. Younger people increasingly used the more common form of ASL. This is essential to understanding that the time span of Black ASL seems to have a start and an end point. Its starting point can be traced to the inception of a school for Black deaf students, and its decline coincides with integration because there's less isolation. That means that the language is starting to revert back to something, perhaps a standard dialect. Now it's even more important to recognize different regional dialects because there can be a limited lifespan for a particular dialect. If you know of an ethnic community and want to study their dialect, start with older people who went to school during that time. Look at what language they use with their friends or cohort. The idea is that if they have their own signs, you'll see that even if today people generally use one sign, the older cohort may still use their old signs. Often, people keep using old signs because of social isolation. This can happen with signs. Some dialects will keep using old forms, while a standard dialect has newer forms. This observation means that the rate of change may be faster depending on how much interaction people have with each other. The more transient a community is, the more its language will change. By contrast, communities that are more insular will keep using the same forms, so it ends up looking much like archaic signs. Social mobility is the transience I just described. Mobility results in increased standardization because it allows for exposure to a standard dialect. The more mobile people are, the more forms they see, leading toward convergence on one standard dialect, which usually becomes considered the national sign language. Now, that means that this language will change as normal, but it helps to know what it means to have a standard mainstream dialect apart from regional dialects. Studying dialects was eye-opening because it meant that people started to realize that until that point, studies had only focused on structural and cognitive approaches. Identifying components of signs helped to analyze structure, but to know why different structures are used, we had to understand the people. Sometimes variation has to do with the age of exposure, which would influence how a person signs, especially if they aren't fully proficient. The two types of accounts weren't sufficient to understand why people in different places signed differently. Differences are tied to the history of a community, warranting an historical linguistic approach to fill these gaps. That meant that the integration of these approaches would help because each aspect of historical documentation contributes to accurate reconstruction. Now, one community's past could differ from that of another community. Comparing the timelines of different dialects allows us to see when changes occurred in each one, revealing whether one community was more insular. If so, you can use this data to help reconstruct their evolution. This would reveal periods of stable transmission or change. It helps to see when an old form was in use and at what point the community may have come into contact with another community, thus causing a faster rate of change. This is one way of explaining change. It's important to recognize that while America has one sign language, there are many dialects because the time it takes for change impacts language differently in different communities, resulting in different dialects. To summarize the topic of variation and dialects, contributing factors are consequences of geography and societal policy. When studying historically isolated communities, you can predict that their sign language would change more slowly. Another topic that I didn't mention has to do with people who may sign differently than others within the community or dialect. Usually this has to do with learning, which often relates to when they were first exposed to sign language. The older a person is, the less likely that they will achieve complete mastery of ASL. This is important to point out, as we'll discuss that further in Module 3.